During my own birthday dinner, my son leaned across the table and asked, "What have you ever left behind?" The room froze. The cake sat untouched, candles dripping wax onto frosting, as though even the flames hesitated to breathe. Forks dangled midair, glasses hovered halfway to lips. The laughter that had been floating around the table a moment ago was gone, replaced by a silence so sharp it rang in his ears. It wasn't curiosity that asked the question. It was judgment. It was dismissal, wrapped in the skin of a son's voice. His words weren't seeking an answer. They were delivering a verdict that cut deeper than any insult, because it was framed as truth. What have you ever left behind? He sat there, the question echoing in his chest like a hollow drum. What had he left? His son's eyes said it already. Nothing. No fortune with his name stamped on it. No foundation or trust. No office with his portrait on the wall. Just an old man with roughened hands and years of stories that had never been heard. His daughter shifted uneasily, pretending to busy herself with pouring water into an already full glass. His grandchildren whispered beneath the table, their glowing screens illuminating their young faces, laughing at strangers online while ignoring the man who had carried their family's past inside him. He felt invisible in the room where he should have mattered most. Inside, memories stirred like ashes in a forgotten fire. He thought of the nights he had spent writing, alone in dim light when the world was quiet. Letters he never sent, pages folded and hidden away because he had convinced himself they were too personal, too fragile, too unworthy of another's eyes. He had kept them sealed, thinking there would be time, thinking maybe one day they would matter. But now, under the weight of his son's question, all those unsent letters screamed inside him, proof that his life had been more than what they chose to see. Still, he said nothing. His tongue held back, as it always had, keeping his truth prisoner behind his teeth. The silence around the table grew heavier, smothering him, pressing his shoulders lower. They all moved on too quickly, pretending the question hadn't split the air open. Plates clinked again, chairs scraped, laughter was forced back into the corners of the room, but he knew the wound had been made. And as he sat there, the words echoed again and again inside his skull. What have you ever left behind? It was a question meant to humiliate, meant to shrink him, but it did something else. It awakened the quiet fire of memory, the knowledge of those hidden letters, each carrying a fragment of his soul, each one waiting in silence for the moment to be revealed. They thought he had left nothing. They thought his life was a trail that vanished behind him without a trace. They did not know that in a box beneath his bed sat the map of his heart, written in ink and folded into the shape of a legacy. And one day, when the time was right, those letters would speak.
And when they did, the silence his family had given him would finally break.
Friends, let me pause here for just a moment. Write in the comments where you're listening from, and tell me, has anything like this ever happened in your own life? Don't forget to subscribe and share this video, because that's how you help us grow this channel. And now, let's continue. That night the house was quiet, but inside his chest there was still the echo of the question, what have you ever left behind? It had cut deeper than his son or grandson knew, because the answer did not lie in monuments or businesses or even possessions. It lay in silence, in the things he had never dared to show. He walked to his room slowly, as though every step was weighed down by all the years of being overlooked, of being asked to stay quiet, of being told he was nothing more than a shadow at their table. Beneath his bed, where dust collected and time hid its secrets, sat a weathered box. His hands trembled as he reached for it, though he knew the weight was lighter than what it carried inside. The rope was rough, frayed by decades of being tied and untied in secret moments when he needed to remember that he once had a voice. He lifted the lid, and the smell rushed out. Old paper, ink long dried, the faint trace of another lifetime pressed between folded sheets. There they were, stacks of letters, bundled with string, each one a chapter of a story he never had the courage to send. Some were to his wife in the early days, words of gratitude he never spoke out loud. Some were to his children when they were small, lines of hope, dreams, prayers that he believed might shape their future if only he dared to give them away. Others were to strangers who had crossed his path for a moment, a teacher he admired, a worker he respected, a friend he lost touch with. And some were not to anyone at all, but to God, to himself, to the silence that always felt safer than the sting of rejection. The ink had faded, but the words were alive. They carried the warmth of a man who loved more than he was ever able to show, who gave more than anyone ever knew, who tried to leave behind not wealth or titles, but fragments of his heart pressed into sentences. Each envelope was a life never lived, a kindness never delivered, a truth left unspoken. And as he touched them, he wondered if maybe these letters, were his real legacy, hidden in the dark, waiting to breathe. He sat on the edge of the bed, one bundle in his lap, and thought of how foolish it might look to others. To his family, they would only be old papers. But to him, they were everything he could not be when the world demanded silence. And now, after that cruel question, after being dismissed as a man who left nothing, he wondered if perhaps the time had come. The letters had waited long enough. The letter trembled slightly in his hand, though the room was still. The lamplight pressed against the faded ink, drawing out the words he had once written with a heart too heavy to speak. His breath slowed as though the paper itself demanded reverence, demanded the kind of listening he had never received in life. He could remember exactly where he was when he wrote that one. At the kitchen table, the clock ticking too loudly, the house already asleep. His wife had walked past him earlier that night, her silence sharper than any argument. He had opened his mouth to call her back, to pour out what pressed against his chest, but fear of indifference sealed his lips. So he wrote instead. He wrote as though the pen could hold what his voice could not. Words of apology, of gratitude, of longing, filling the page until his hand cramped. He folded the letter carefully, slid it into an envelope, and placed it on the counter. But morning came, and with it, shame. He took the letter back, tucked it under his shirt, and buried it where no eyes would ever find it. That was the beginning of the vow. He had not planned it, not spoken it out loud, but it grew inside him with each failed attempt to bridge the gulf between his heart and the world. Every time his voice quivered, every time his words were brushed aside with impatience or laughter, he told himself, better to stay silent than to be dismissed. And so his truth retreated, not into nothingness, but into letters that grew in number, piled together, whispering in the dark. When his children were small, he wanted to tell them stories of the nights he worked 2 jobs to keep the lights on, of the mornings he walked miles to spare them the bus fare. He wanted to tell them that their laughter was his reward, that their smallest achievements were his greatest triumphs. But life around him always seemed louder, more pressing. Homework, television, phones ringing. There was never a moment quiet enough to carry the weight of his love. And so he wrote again, I see you. I believe in you. You are my hope. Words sealed away, never spoken aloud. As years passed, the box under the bed grew heavier. The vow hardened. He told himself that silence was not weakness but dignity, that keeping his words hidden gave them more worth than scattering them carelessly into ears unwilling to listen. But sometimes, late at night, when the house was still, he wondered if his silence was not noble at all, but a quiet surrender, a slow erasing of himself. Every letter was proof that he had lived not without love, but without being heard. Each one a confession, a prayer, a hand reaching out into a void. They were the footprints he left behind, invisible to the world, but imprinted on paper. His life was not measured in monuments, not in applause or recognition, but in envelopes sealed with trembling hands and hidden from the very people who inspired them. And yet tonight, after the sting of his family's words, what have you ever left behind? The vow that had once sheltered him pressed like a stone on his chest. Silence no longer felt like dignity. It felt like a prison. His hands shook as he placed the letter back on the stack, the twine binding them groaning slightly under the weight. For the first time, he wondered if those letters, all those unspoken truths, were not meant to remain hidden. Maybe silence had not been protecting him. Maybe it had been stealing from him all along. His fingers found the oldest envelope, its edges yellowed, the paper almost brittle from the years it had spent waiting in silence. He knew which one it was before he even unfolded it. The first letter he ever wrote, and never sent. The one addressed to the woman whose absence had left the deepest wound in his chest. His mother. He remembered that night as if time had refused to let it fade. She had been sitting in the kitchen, her face tired, her hands worn from years of labor, and he had spoken to her with a sharpness that was undeserved. The words were quick, impatient, fueled by pride and frustration, but not by truth. She had asked for help, for patience, for something small, and he had turned it into a battle, proving a point that did not need to be proven. And the next morning, she was gone. Not gone from the house, but gone forever. The phone call came hours later. A heart that had worked too hard had simply stopped. There was no second chance, no final word, no moment to take back what he should never have said. The letter before him was his attempt to give himself that moment, even if the world had denied it. "My dearest mother," it began, written in the careful hand of a much younger man. The ink had faded, but the pain was fresh as ever. He read each word slowly, almost mouthing it, as if she were listening from somewhere just beyond the reach of his sight. He confessed his arrogance, the careless way he had dismissed her voice, the cowardice in not telling her how much she meant to him while there was still time. He promised in that letter that he would become better, that her sacrifices would not be wasted, that the child she raised would honor her by living a life she would be proud of. But as his eyes lingered over the closing lines, he felt the sharp weight of truth. He had failed his own promise. He had lived, yes, but mostly in shadows. He had worked and struggled, but he had allowed silence to become his inheritance. He had built a box of letters instead of a life where his words could breathe. And though he had written to her that he would always speak with courage, in reality he had spent decades burying his voice under fear. Tears blurred the words, and he pressed the page to his chest. It was not just a letter to a mother long gone. It was the echo of his own lost years. It was the reminder that regret multiplies when silence takes root, that promises written but never lived are as heavy as stones. He sat for a long while, hearing her voice in memory, not angry, not accusing, but gentle, as it always had been, patient in a way he had never deserved. He wished he could place the letter in her hand, let her see the truth in his eyes, beg forgiveness in words instead of ink. But all he could do was whisper into the dark, his lips trembling over the same apology he had written so long ago. "I'm sorry. I should have said this when you were here." The box of letters sat open beside him, a silent chorus of confessions waiting their turn. And he realized something else. Each of them carried not just his secrets, but his failures to speak when it mattered. His mother had never heard this apology. But perhaps, just perhaps, others still could. The next bundle he untied was thicker, the twine cutting slightly into his fingers as if even time wanted him to hesitate before opening it. These pages carried a different weight than the one to his mother. Not the tender ache of love and regret, but the scar of betrayal, raw once and now hardened into silence. He slid the top letter free, and there, in uneven strokes, his younger hand had addressed a name he hadn't spoken aloud in decades. A friend once closer than a brother. The one who had turned his trust into currency, who had taught him that sometimes it is the people you lean on that strike the hardest. He remembered those early days, the nights of shared laughter, the plans scribbled on napkins, the secrets exchanged with the kind of honesty reserved for someone you believe will never leave. They had been inseparable, woven together by dreams bigger than their small lives. He trusted him with everything, with hopes, with failures, with the vulnerable truths a man keeps hidden from the world, but hands to one person like a gift. And then, one day, that gift was sold. The betrayal wasn't dramatic. There was no shouting, no fight in the street. It was quieter, crueler. Words he had spoken in confidence appeared where they never should have been, in boardrooms, in rumors, in the mouths of strangers who knew things they had no right to know. What he had given in trust had been turned into leverage, bartered for advantage. His friend had taken his voice and exchanged it for power. And in that moment, he had learned what silence was for, not always peace, but armor. The letter on his lap trembled in his hands. "You were the first person I called brother," it began. The handwriting carried anger, sharper than the one he had written to his mother. He poured himself into those lines, asking the questions he never dared to speak aloud. Why wasn't I enough? Why did you trade me for scraps of approval, for coins that cannot buy back trust? Did you ever remember the nights we dreamed, or were you only waiting for the day you could sell them? He read on, and with each word the ache of old wounds returned. He had written of humiliation, of the nights he lay awake replaying conversations that no longer belonged to him, of the day he realized that even the strongest friendship is fragile if weighed against greed. He had written that he would forgive someday, though he never did, that he would forget, though the fact the letter still existed was proof he had not. The ink had bled in places where his hand had pressed too hard, or where an old tear had fallen. It was not just a letter to a friend. It was a grave marker for trust itself. He folded it slowly, pressing it back against the others, as if closing a door that still wanted to remain ajar. Betrayal had taught him not to expect explanations, not to ask for loyalty, to build walls around the most fragile parts of himself. And perhaps, he thought bitterly, that was why so many of these letters had never been sent. He had been betrayed once, and the silence that followed had been safer than any promise. Yet as he placed the bundle back in the box, he wondered if silence had also robbed him of something greater. Not just the friend he lost, but the man he might have become if he had dared to keep trusting. Perhaps every betrayal does not only steal the bond, but reshapes the betrayed into someone smaller, quieter, more guarded. He wasn't sure anymore which loss was greater. The box whispered still, each folded page calling him deeper into a past he both feared and needed to face. And he knew the next letter would only cut sharper, because some wounds do not come from enemies or even friends, but from those who once called themselves family. The next letter in the box was softer, almost fragile, as though even the paper itself had aged differently. The edges were worn, as if he had pulled it out countless times only to tuck it back again, never daring to let it see the light. The handwriting here was slower, more careful, as though he had written each word with trembling hands. This was not the sharp sting of betrayal or the raw grief of a son to a mother. This was the ache of choice, the kind that follows a man through his entire life, haunting him in every quiet hour. It began with her name, a name he still could not whisper without his voice catching, even after all these years. She had been the one person who saw him before the world demanded masks and compromises, who believed not in his potential, but in his presence, who loved him without weighing his worth against what he could offer. With her, life had been simple, a hand held in secret, laughter that came too easily, nights where even silence felt full. He had known joy then, unguarded and unearned, and yet he let her go. The letter told why. Not because he didn't love her, but because he thought reason was stronger than feeling. He thought stability mattered more than passion, approval more than authenticity, duty more than desire. He had chosen the path that looked straighter, safer, the one others told him would be right, and in doing so he had torn himself from the one place where he was fully known. He wrote of that day like a fracture line across his life, a split between what might have been and what was. He didn't cry then, not in front of her, but the ink on these pages revealed the tears he never showed. He wrote of watching her walk away, of hearing her laugh in another man's presence years later, and of realizing that love doesn't vanish. It simply chooses a different house to live in. He carried her ghost like a heartbeat under his own. He wrote of wondering if she ever thought of him, if she ever remembered the small promises whispered between them. Did she still hum that song when she was alone? Did she ever open the drawer where he had left a note, unsigned, because he was too afraid of what sending it would mean? His words were not bitter. They were heavy with tenderness, the kind that doesn't fade but transforms into regret. He confessed that he never hated her for moving on. How could he? It was he who had let her go, who had chosen silence over fight, who had walked away when his heart screamed to stay. He wrote that he had lived a decent life, perhaps even a respectable one, but respectability is a poor substitute for the warmth of a soul that was once entwined with yours. The pages trembled in his hands as he reread the lines. I chose reason, and it cost me love. I built a life that looked whole from the outside, but I know where the crack runs. I feel it every morning when I wake, and every night before I sleep. The day I lost you, something in me stayed lost. He folded the letter slowly, pressing it against his chest for a moment longer before returning it to the bundle. This was not anger, not shame, but something deeper. The acknowledgement that sometimes the greatest betrayals are not what others do to us, but what we do to ourselves when we choose fear over love. And as he let the letter rest again in the box, he understood why he had never mailed it. Some truths are too fragile to hand back to the person who inspired them. They are not meant to reopen old lives, but to keep a dying flame alive in one's own. It wasn't about her anymore. It was about him, about carrying the weight of a choice that could never be undone. The box still waited. The next letters would open doors he had kept sealed even tighter, because after the friend, the mother, the woman, there were still others, wounds cut by blood, by family, by the ones who should have stood closest. This letter was not long. In fact, it was the shortest of them all, and yet it weighed more than the whole bundle combined. The pages were not filled edge to edge with words the way the others were. There were only a few lines, but the spaces between them carried the silence of years. It wasn't anger that shaped these sentences, not disappointment, not even confusion. It was something deeper, the kind of grief a father feels when he realizes that the bond he thought unbreakable had grown brittle in his own hands. The first words were not reproach, but confession. He wrote of the times he had chosen work over play, silence over listening, pride over patience. He admitted how often his own fears had spilled out as harshness, how often his attempts to teach had felt like punishment instead of love. He recalled small moments, ordinary ones, that now cut like glass. A soccer game he missed, a birthday he barely noticed, a conversation where his son's eyes dimmed because his father's answers were sharp instead of soft. These weren't grand betrayals, no dramatic scenes. They were the 1,000 quiet choices that built a wall brick by brick, until one day there was nothing but silence on the other side. The letter did not say, "Why don't you call?" Instead, it whispered, "I know why you don't." That was the hardest part. Understanding that the silence wasn't without cause. It was earned, in a way, by his own blind years, when he thought authority was enough to replace affection, when he thought provision was the same as presence. He wrote that he had wanted to be strong for his son, but in trying to be unshakable, he had become unreachable. The lines were heavy, with a yearning so pure it hurt to read. I don't need your apology, my son. I don't need you to say you forgive me. All I want is the sound of your voice, one more time, saying, Dad, I understand. It was not a demand. It was not a plea shouted into the void. It was the softest request, laid on paper because it had nowhere else to go. He admitted that he carried his phone like a talisman, checking it too often, hoping for a name that never appeared on the screen. He wrote about how birthdays came and went, holidays passed in empty rooms, and each silence was another confirmation that love withheld is love that may never return. Yet still, he hoped. Hope was cruel, but it was all he had left. At the bottom of the page, there was a single, unfinished sentence. The ink stopped mid-word, as though the courage to finish had run out. Maybe he didn't know what to write, or maybe the truth was too sharp to put into language. The paper itself seemed to ache under the weight of what was left unsaid. He folded the letter carefully, slower than the others, as though afraid that even the act of closing it would shatter the fragile thread of longing that tied him to the son who no longer answered. For a moment he pressed it to his lips, not in prayer, not in ritual, but in a quiet act of remembering what it felt like to kiss his boy's forehead goodnight, long ago, when answers always came and silence was never this heavy. The box grew heavier with every return. Each letter was not just memory but confession, an unspoken history of a man who had left behind more than anyone realized. And yet, this one, this silent cry to a son who had turned away, cut deepest of all. The question had already cut deep, but what followed pressed even harder. The one who had thrown the challenge, "What have you ever left behind?" was the same one who now leaned closer, almost mocking, almost curious, as if sniffing at a wound. His voice was lighter this time, less cruel, though it carried the sting of disbelief. "Then show us. Read them." The room shifted as if the air itself turned colder. It wasn't just a request, it was a dare. The old man froze. His hand instinctively moved toward the box that lay at his feet, hidden just under the tablecloth, as though protecting a secret too raw to be touched. These letters had lived only in the dark, sealed by his silence, written in the privacy of nights when nobody cared to listen. They were not meant for an audience. They were pieces of his soul, fragments of shame and love and wounds he had carried alone. To read them aloud was not simply to speak, it was to believe. For a long moment he said nothing. The weight of years pressed against his chest, memories cascading in a flood. His mother's gentle hands, the friend who betrayed him, the woman he let slip away, the son who no longer called. Each page was a testament not to triumph, but to all the ways he had been broken, and to all the ways he had failed. How could he expose that? How could he open himself to laughter again, this time with his very heart spread bare across the table? Yet something inside him shifted. Perhaps it was the tone, that demand to prove, to justify, to show that his life had meant something. Or perhaps it was because, for once, someone was asking to hear, not pushing him into silence. Even if it was said with a smirk, even if it was meant as a test, it was still an opening. And he realized that to die with these words locked away would be the greater betrayal, not of them, but of himself. His hands trembled as he reached for the box. The twine crackled, brittle with age, as he untied the knot he had tied so many times before. The sound filled the silence like thunder in a hollow church. All eyes followed his movements. Some leaned back, already uncomfortable, already regretting the provocation. Others leaned forward, hungry, not for wisdom, but for spectacle. And yet, as he opened the lid, the air grew heavier, as though everyone in the room suddenly understood this was no ordinary box. This was a coffin of words, and he was about to open it. He looked down at the first stack of letters, his own handwriting, uneven, shaky at times, pressed harder at others where the ink had bled with anger or with tears. His throat tightened, and for a heartbeat he nearly shut the box again. But then he remembered the nights he had written these, the loneliness that had wrapped him like a second skin. If silence had been his curse then, perhaps voice could be his redemption now. So he lifted the first letter, smoothing the fragile paper with his thumb. He did not look at the faces around him, not the one who challenged him, not the ones who doubted, not even the ones who might pity him. He looked instead at the ink, at the words that had waited so long to be heard. And when he began to read, his voice did not crack, it did not tremble. It carried the weight of years, heavy but steady, like the toll of a bell that refuses to be ignored. In that moment, the room shifted again. No longer a place of mockery or judgment. It became a courtroom of truth. And for the first time, his words were not background noise to be dismissed, but testimony, living, undeniable, irrevocable. The living room had never felt so small. The walls, once decorated with laughter, now seemed to close in like witnesses. The old man sat in his worn chair, the box of letters resting on his lap, his hands trembling, not from age, but from the weight of what was about to unfold. Around him, his family sat stiff, some leaning back with folded arms, others leaning forward with restless curiosity. No one spoke. The silence was a stage, and for the first time in his life, his voice was not dismissed but awaited. He unfolded the first letter with a slowness that felt ceremonial, as though each crease in the paper carried a pulse of memory. His eyes scanned the ink, faded but still sharp, and he began to read. The words did not rush. They fell heavy, one by one, like stones dropped into water, sending ripples that no one could ignore. He read of promises he never kept, apologies he never delivered, confessions too fragile for the world to hear at the time. He read of love unspoken, of shame endured, of betrayals that cut him to the bone. Each line seemed to echo beyond the paper, as if the years themselves leaned forward to listen. His voice was not the voice they knew, not the rambling elder whose stories they rolled their eyes at, not the background hum of someone they had learned to tune out. It was steady, almost solemn, as though truth itself was speaking through him. The family shifted uncomfortably. His son clenched his jaw, his daughter glanced away. The grandchildren fidgeted with their sleeves. The words were not abstract. They were blood. And every sentence forced them to see him not as an old man with endless stories, but as someone who had carried a life too heavy for one heart alone. The letters painted pictures they had never imagined. A young man writing to his mother in the shadow of regret. A betrayed friend carving forgiveness in ink, but never in speech. A lover choosing duty over passion and breaking quietly in the process. He read of long nights, waiting for calls that never came, of a father's heart cracking under the silence of his own child. The letters had no polish, no grand rhetoric, just raw, aching honesty that could not be softened. The room seemed to bend beneath the words. It was not entertainment, not a story to half listen to while sipping tea. It was a mirror none of them wanted to face. Each letter left its mark. Guilt in one corner, shame in another, a shadow of recognition in another. Some tried to avoid his gaze. Others stared at him as though seeing him for the first time. When he finally set the first letter down on the table, it lay there like a verdict. No one reached for it, no one dared touch it. It was as though the paper itself burned with everything unsaid for decades. And then he reached for another, his hand shaking not from fear but from the unrelenting flood that was about to continue. There was no turning back now. The room had become his courtroom, his confessional, his altar. And though each word reopened old wounds, they also began stitching something invisible, something truer than the silence that had covered his life. The reading had begun, and with it, the reckoning. The air in the room was no longer the same. Where once there had been the low hum of chatter, the shuffling of feet, the muffled laughter meant to drown him out, Now there was stillness, the kind that makes every breath sound louder than it should. He lifted another letter, the paper thin and fragile, yet somehow stronger than the years of silence it had survived. His voice wavered only for a moment before finding its steadiness again, and as he spoke, the weight of each word pressed into the walls, into the people, into the marrow of the family who had once dismissed him. Smiles faded as quickly as morning frost. The children who once giggled at his pauses and rolled their eyes when he tried to tell them another story now sat upright, wide-eyed, as though afraid to miss a single syllable. Their fidgeting stilled, even their breathing slowed. It wasn't just the novelty of hearing him. It was the realization that his voice, his letters, his buried truth carried a kind of gravity that pulled them into silence. His son, the very one who had hurled the cruelest question, "What have you ever left behind?" no longer leaned back with disdain. He sat forward, elbows on his knees, hands clasped too tightly, the veins in them stark against his skin. His lips, which had so often cut off his father's words with irritation, now stayed closed, pressed tight, as though holding back a tremor. For the first time in years, he was not waiting to interrupt, not ready to argue or dismiss. He was listening, truly listening. And that, perhaps, was the greatest shift of all. The daughter glanced at her brother, then back to her father, as though caught between shame and revelation. Her eyes glistened in the dim light, and though she blinked furiously to disguise it, the tears betrayed her. Each word from the letters was not only a confession of what he had endured, but a record of what they had failed to see. The man they had thought of as quiet, as irrelevant, as an old relic taking up space at the table, was instead the quiet scaffolding that had held them up all along. The grandchildren leaned forward, knees pulled up, chins resting on their hands. To them, he had been the background noise of family gatherings, a man of endless words with no audience. But now they sat spellbound, seeing not a rambling elder, but a man whose silence had kept his pain from staining their childhoods, whose restraint had shielded them from storms they never knew he bore. And with every letter, every truth spoken aloud, the house itself seemed to change. The old clock on the wall ticked heavier, slower, like a witness counting down the beats of a confession long overdue. The floor creaked beneath shifting feet, but no one left. No one excused themselves. The silence had become sacred, the room a sanctuary where truth had finally found its voice. By the time he set down the next letter, his hand trembling more from the emotion than from age, the transformation was complete. This was no longer a family gathering where he was a tolerated presence. This was a tribunal of memory, a reckoning of conscience, a place where the ignored had become undeniable. The room had changed, and with it, so had they. It happened suddenly, so quickly, that for a moment he thought his tired eyes had deceived him. One of the letters, the one addressed to the friend who had betrayed him, slipped from the small stack in his lap and fell onto the carpet. Before he could lean forward to retrieve it, a hand, familiar yet trembling with unease, snatched it up. There was no pause, no request, just a sharp, nervous movement, and then the sound of paper tearing. It was a sound he had known before in a different life. It was the sound of promises breaking, of trust being ripped apart, of pages that once carried love or loyalty being destroyed because the truth they carried was too heavy for someone else to bear. Only this time, it was not a stranger or an enemy. It was his own blood, his own kin, who tore the letter clean down the middle, who crushed its halves in trembling fists and tossed them toward the trash as though silence could still be salvaged if only paper was destroyed. For a moment the room was filled not with his voice, but with the shreds of his past fluttering to the ground. A fragment of a sentence, "I never stopped believing," lay broken across the torn page, incomplete now, its meaning dangling in air. The words that had been his shield and his confession, written in nights of solitude when no one else wanted to hear, were dismissed again, and the wound reopened. Not just the old wound of his friend's betrayal, but a new one, fresher and crueler, because it came from within his own house. It was as if time had folded in on itself, repeating the lesson he had already learned, that truth, however carefully preserved, was always vulnerable to those who feared it most. The silence after was suffocating. No one laughed this time. No one dared dismiss it with nervous chatter. Instead, their eyes darted between him and the torn letter, guilt heavy in their stares. The grandchildren shifted uncomfortably, no longer sure whether to defend the act or to mourn it. The son, who had once questioned him, sat frozen, his lips tight, but said nothing. Shame held his tongue still. He did not move to rescue the pieces. He only sat there, his hands resting on the other letters, as though protecting them now with the last of his strength. His eyes followed the scraps on the floor, not with anger, but with a grief so quiet it pressed harder than any raised voice could. His chest lifted and fell in slow rhythm, every breath fighting against the urge to collapse inward. In that moment it became clear. Even here, even now, after truth had begun to shine, there were still those who would rather silence him than face the weight of what he had carried. Erasure was their instinct, as though to tear the page was to erase the guilt it contained. But the truth had already been spoken aloud. The letter might be torn, the paper ruined, but the words, once heard, could never be unwritten. He looked at them, his family, not with fury, but with the sorrow of a man who had spent a lifetime learning how fragile honesty is when it collides with fear. The betrayal he had once endured from a friend had now echoed in the faces of those who should have guarded him most, and yet, beneath the pain, there was a strange clarity. Paper could be torn, but memory could not. The room, which only moments before had shifted into reverence, now carried another weight, the shame of trying to silence him once more, and the dawning knowledge that they had failed. For a long moment he did not move, the shreds of the letter lying like fallen leaves at his feet. The air was heavy, thick with guilt, as though the entire room held its breath, waiting to see if he would let the past die once again. His fingers trembled, not with weakness, but with the ache of recognition. He had lived through this before, watching truth torn apart, dismissed, forgotten. He knew too well the sound of erasure. And yet, something deeper within him refused to let this be the end. Slowly, painfully, he bent forward and gathered the torn pieces one by one. They were crumpled, edges jagged, the ink smudged by the heat of impatient hands. Each fragment felt like a piece of himself, discarded, unwanted, but still alive. As he lifted them from the floor, his hand shook, not from age, but from the weight of reliving betrayals that spanned decades. And then, unexpectedly, another hand reached across the silence. It was his, the very one who had asked, "What have you ever left behind?" The one who had cut him first with the question that opened this wound. He stopped the restless, guilty fingers of others that had twitched toward the letters again, as if to finish what had been started. His voice was steady now, sharp with command, though quieter than a whisper. No more. He took the scraps from the old man's hands gently, reverently, as though they were relics instead of ruined paper. His eyes searched the fragments as if hunting for meaning in every smudge, every torn line. Then, without hesitation, he stood, walked to the desk, and pulled open a drawer. From it, he lifted a simple roll of tape. No one spoke as the sound of tearing tape filled the room, the strange, sacred counterpoint to the sound of tearing paper that had wounded them only minutes before. Piece by piece, he laid the fragments flat, aligning edges with a patience that felt almost like penance. His fingers pressed the tape carefully, smoothing each seam, refusing to let even a single word vanish. Some lines overlapped, some remained scarred, but the message was returning. The letter was being remade, scar by scar, wound by wound. And then he began to read. His voice carried not only the words written decades ago, but the weight of choosing to give them life again. What had been mocked, what had been silenced, was now spoken with a reverence none of them had expected. Each phrase landed like a stone in still water, sending ripples through the family's silence. The old man watched, his chest rising and falling with uneven breaths. For the first time, someone else was carrying his truth, holding it up to the light rather than trying to hide it in the dark. For years, his letters had been only whispers in his drawer, confessions inked in solitude. Tonight, even torn and patched with tape, they were alive in a voice that was not his own, and that voice refused to stop. The others shifted in their seats, uncomfortable, ashamed, transfixed. They had thought paper could burn, that ink could be silenced. But as the words unfolded, fractured, taped, yet undeniable, they realized something terrible and beautiful. What is written in suffering cannot be erased by the hands of those who fear it. Ink, once spilled, carries the stubbornness of memory. It stains, it stays. And though the page bore scars, it was stronger now than before. Its brokenness was its proof. Its survival was its testimony. The old man's eyes glistened as he leaned back, no longer needing to fight. The truth had found another voice, another guardian. The letters he never mailed had finally left him, not in an envelope, not in a postman's bag, but in the mouth of the very one who had doubted him. And as the words filled the room, the silence broke. The letters no longer felt like paper. They had transformed into testimony, each page a witness summoned from the shadows. They were not confessions offered in shame, nor pleas for forgiveness whispered into the void. They were ledgers of a soul, the accounting of a life lived too often in silence. One by one, as they were read aloud, the air in the room shifted. The walls, once used to hearing laughter that dismissed and drowned him out, now trembled under the weight of words too heavy to ignore. The family sat rigid, their eyes tracing the cracks in the table rather than meeting his gaze. Each line, each scar written in ink, dragged their memories to the surface. A letter about his mother's last days was not just grief. It was proof of promises broken, moments lost because pride and busyness had been louder than love. A letter to the friend who betrayed him wasn't only about betrayal. It was a record of loyalty given without return, the measure of a man who had chosen trust, even when it cost him dearly. A letter to the woman he didn't marry wasn't about regret alone. It was a reminder of the choices he made not out of selfishness, but out of duty, of sacrifices that no one ever saw. And then came the words to his son. Short, raw, stripped of every shield. No accusations, no rehearsed excuses. Only the aching simplicity of a father's heart, asking for a single call, a single bridge rebuilt across the years. The room seemed to shrink, every breath harder to take, as those words echoed louder than any sermon, louder than any laughter they had used to cover his voice before. For the first time, their silence was not dismissive. It was reverent. It was forced by the undeniability of truth. These were not stories meant to entertain around a dinner table. They were not ramblings of an old man trying to stretch minutes into hours. They were receipts of existence, pages marked by the price of being human, proof of both failures and faithfulness. It was uncomfortable, unbearably so. Shame sat like an uninvited guest at the head of the table. The family could no longer hide behind the easy cruelty of smirks or the indulgent tolerance of letting him speak and then forgetting his words. The letters refused to be forgotten. They were louder than their laughter, sharper than their mockery. The one who had first asked the question, "What have you ever left behind?" now realized he had unleashed an avalanche. He had wanted to shame him, to press him into silence. Instead, he had opened a vault, and from that vault poured not gold or silver, but truths heavier than any inheritance. The debts of love, the credits of sacrifice, the balance sheet of a man's life. Injustice had lived in their house for years, not because of cruelty shouted, but because of worth left unspoken. And now, justice had finally arrived. Not in a courtroom or on a stage, but right there in their living room, through torn pages taped together and read aloud with a trembling voice that refused to falter. The old man sat back, his face unreadable, but his eyes glistened with a quiet fire. He had not needed this reckoning, not for himself. He had written the letters for the silence, not for an audience. But now that they were out in the open, he saw what they had become, not his burden, but their mirror. And for the first time in many years, the room did not belong to their laughter. It belonged to his truth. Decades and now lay scattered like shards of glass across the table. And then, almost without sound, his son reached down. His hands, the same hands that once had pushed him away with impatience, gathered the torn scraps of paper from the floor. He did not speak, perhaps because he had no words large enough to cover years of dismissal. He simply cleared the mess he had helped create, piece by piece, until only the letters remained in front of his father, no longer trash but testimony. When he rose again, he placed a glass of water before the old man. No apology spoken, but in that gesture lived one louder than any speech, the acknowledgement of thirst, of effort, of dignity too long ignored. Those who had once torn at the pages sat stiff, their fingers trembling as they reached for the fragments. Now, instead of rending them apart, they touched the paper as if it were fragile skin, something living that could bleed if handled too roughly. The very letters they had mocked moments earlier now looked untouchable, holy even, like relics passed down from a generation they had never cared to understand. Their eyes, once sharp with judgment, now dropped low. They could not meet his gaze. They could not bear to see the man they had reduced to silence, sitting taller than them all, lifted not by pride, but by the unshakable truth of a life finally spoken aloud. It was not the dramatic begging for forgiveness that filled the room. No tears shed in loud apologies, no staged reconciliation. The reckoning came quietly, heads bent, hands still, movements small but full of meaning. Shame worked its way through the family in silence, the same silence they had once demanded of him. But this silence was different. It was not dismissal. It was surrender. It was the bowing of pride to something greater, something undeniable. The old man did not smile, did not cry. He only sipped the water, feeling the coolness travel down his throat like a balm on old wounds. He watched his son sit beside him, not across from him, and he felt the letters being held with a tenderness that had never touched his words before. For the first time in a long time, he was not explaining, not justifying, not trying to make himself heard. The room itself had bent to him. His story had finally claimed its rightful place. The lowered eyes around him said more than apologies ever could. They were the admission that they had failed, not in love, but in listening. They had missed him while he was alive, while his voice was steady and his letters unwritten. Now they knew. Now the silence they had imposed had broken, and in its ruin lay something closer to truth, closer to reconciliation. And for the first time in years, he did not feel invisible. He felt seen, not because they looked at him, but because they could not. Their lowered eyes were the final proof. Justice had reached even then. The box no longer lived in the shadows beneath his bed. It did not gather dust in secrecy or wait for a trembling hand to pull it into the light. No, the box stood now in the open, on the living room table, its corners worn soft by years of hiding, its lid breathing for the first time. The family did not let it vanish again. They carried it with careful hands, as though it were something sacred, and placed it not in a closet, not in a drawer, but in the family's library, among the volumes meant to be passed down, the shelves meant to hold what mattered. No longer his private burden, no longer his lonely silence. His words had entered the archive of their lives. Inside that box, bound by string, were decades of truth, letters that had once burned only in his chest, unsent, unheard, unopened. But at the very top rested one last envelope, freshly written, its ink still dark, its paper uncreased. The handwriting was steady, deliberate, as if every word carried the weight of all those years. On the front, unlike the others, there was no name of a mother, a friend, a son, or a lost love. There was only one line, "To myself, sent." For the first time, he had not written to be answered, not written to be saved, not written in the desperate hope of breaking silence. He had written to acknowledge himself, to give his own life the dignity no one else had dared to. And this time he had sent it, because the act of being heard no longer depended on anyone else. The family stood around that box in silence, not the cruel silence that once erased him at the dinner table, but the reverent silence of people in a sanctuary. They had laughed, dismissed, torn at his words, but now their lowered heads, their softened hands, their steady breath in the room, this was their admission. They would not bury his voice again. They would carry it forward. The grandchildren, once impatient with his stories, touched the letters as if touching a living thread to their own future. The son, who had asked the question that had cut so deep, now understood that the answer had been waiting all along, in paper, in ink, in pain transformed into testimony. Justice had not come with thunder, not with vengeance, not even with speeches. It came with the quiet endurance of truth that refused to die. Truth that found its way to the light even after decades of being silenced. It came with recognition, not applause. It came with that final letter to myself, sent, reminding them all that the most important legacy we leave is not property, not titles, not monuments, but honest words. Words that live when everything else fades, words that finally reach where they were meant to go. That night, when the house fell still, he sat in his chair and looked at the library shelf where the box rested, no longer hidden. He felt no need to explain, no need to defend. His life had spoken. His truth was no longer buried. He closed his eyes, and for the first time in years, he felt light. He had left something behind, and this time it would stay.